Good evening, everyone. Yeah, that seems to work. And for those that have joined since, I'll posted the link in for the handouts in the chat, and I'll also put it on the YouTube. What's called below the YouTube, the details. Where I'll put the link for the handout. So what I wanted to do today was finish a Klali overall look at the source sheets there at the back. Yeah, finish the overall look at some of the classic halachas of warfare. And just to give us a taste of or remind us of the various psukim and sort of gemaras with which we're vaguely familiar, but maybe never sort of collated into one set of halachas. And then spend a little bit of time thinking about the definitions of milchemet mitzvah and milchemet reshus, a voluntary warfare, so-called voluntary warfare, and mitzvah warfare or obligatory warfare. We won't go too much into detail, but maybe just touch on that, especially since someone, I think David mentioned last week, the question actually is milchemet mitzvah and milchemet reshus relevant categories to the modern day state of Israel? And I'll touch on that. And then I would like to begin getting into the thorny issue of civilian casualties and proportionality, which has been obviously extensively discussed in the media now, and the postscript have started addressing and have looked at in the past. So I suppose just to start off where we left off last week, I concluded with the Mishnah in Maseches Ovos, in which the Mishnah says, the famous Mishnah, ben chomesh shonim lemikra, ben eser lemishnah, ben shalosh esrei lemitzvos, etc. And the Mishnah says, ben esrim lirdoif, at age 21 pursues. And the Ramban al HaTorah, and again, I'm not going to go through it, we looked at it last week, the Ramban al HaTorah understands this to mean, based upon the pasuk that counts from ben esrim, that this is referring lirdoif, to pursue, means engaging in military service. In other words, the Mishnah, at least according to the Ramban, is telling us the sad truth that at least until plowshares, swords are beaten into plowshares, until Mashiach comes, sadly, a sort of necessary facet of life and the progression of life is ben chomesh lemikra. At 5, a child starts learning chumash. At 13, they become bar mitzvah. 15, they learn Gemara and so on. And sadly, at 20, they're needed to lirdov, to engage in battle, and that's unfortunately just part of the development of a child into adulthood in the way the world is. Other Mefarshim of Mishnah have different explanations of this term, but the Ramban is an important one and a fascinating one, and contextualizes it. I printed on the source sheets a sort of halachic summary of just some of the mitzvahs that come up in or halachas that come up in the psukim around war. Last week I spoke about sort of the broader hashkafa, the role of Torah and tefillah and achdus and so on, unity in success in war. But here I'm looking specifically at the halachas, and just to everyone can look through the bullet points themselves. Devarim 9:5, that's the first pasuk that I sort of set up psukim I quoted on page 1, is the pasuk reminding us that success in war and possession of Eretz Yisrael are not due to our superiority, but are for Hashem's purposes and plans in the world. Lo b'tzis chosros, says the pasuk, v'yishlo v'echa, it's not yours by right, that you inherit the land. But due to the evil that the Canaanites represented, and as a fulfillment of the covenant, the bris that Hashem made with the others. In Devarim 20, there's a mitzvah not to fear, and this week I didn't print too much of the Rambam because it was just using a large amount of space. But the Rambam paskins this as a halacha that a soldier has to be mechazik themselves in betochen and emunah in Hashem, and not fear and trust in Hashem. I did say extensively at the beginning of the last year, and I want to reiterate it now, that I'm very conscious we're talking about something as a sort of interesting halachic topic. But I'm just muting everyone because I'm getting interference. We're talking about this as if it's a sort of interesting halachic topic. I'm conscious, obviously, that for our incredible and sorry, I'm getting interference several times from the same person, so please just be really careful not to unmute yourselves. I'm conscious that as we're talking, this is not just a theoretical sort of interesting halachic matter, but one that's very relevant to soldiers, to precious soldiers, our young men in our own community and beyond who are out there engaged. And therefore, it's quite easy to sit here in a trite manner running through psukim that tell us just to have bitachon and trust in Hashem. I don't want to be trivial about it. Nonetheless, the psukim tell us that that's the approach that that soldiers at least should aspire to, as should all of us. And then there's the sequence of psukim in that with which we're probably vaguely familiar in Devarim Perek Chaf that talk about the announcements that were made to soldiers who were newly wed or newly pledged, at least betrothed, newly built a house, and indeed even those who are just fearful, in which they are released back home. The Rambam, which we're not going to look at this week, says they're released from active service, but they still have to help behind the lines. It's not that they're released from any service. It's they have to. Armies need logistics and soldiers who are fighting in the front line. They're released from the front line, but still need to engage in supporting the war. Does this apply to Milchemes Rishus, or only to Milchemes Rishus, or even to Milchemes Mitzvah? In other words, is this exemption only from a voluntary war, whatever exactly that means, or even a Milchemes Mitzvah, a compulsory war, of which the most extreme example is a defensive war when Israel is under attack? That's a debate between the poskim, and again, maybe another week we'll go into this and questions from poskim since 48 as to whether any of these halachas are applicable to modern warfare. But that's Devarim 20. Then there's the continuation of Devarim 20, in which is printed on at the bottom of page 1 and the top of page 2, which is calling out in peace. So there's a new sheet. It's on page 1 here. Sorry, I'm talking about on the new sheets. On the new. Yeah, the summary is on the top, but on the actual psukim are at the bottom of page 1 and the top of page 2. That one should call out in peace to enemies. This we will look at in a little bit more detail later, but basically there's a halacha that there should always be an option of peace offered to the enemy before we attack. Now that doesn't mean peace where we'll just give up and give in. It means peace where they'll surrender their arms, cease to be a threat to the Jewish people. The Rambam says they will accept on themselves Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. In other words, there is a halacha of Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach. We don't normally go around enforcing it. So it would be good for a person in faraway Japan or New Zealand to accept upon themselves the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach, but we don't enforce it. However, if someone has proven to be an enemy of the Jewish people, or if they belong to the Canaanite nation or various other people, and we wage war against them, there the deal of peace will include the acceptance of the Sheva Mitzvah. They have to sign up to basic moral codes, otherwise we're skeptical. They remain a living threat to us. In addition, and we'll see this in the Rambam, the Gemara says that they are meshubad to us. Now, meshubad, the root of the word is ayin beis daled, servitude, eved. But the word means lots of different things, and it's not an entirely clear word. For example, if you work for someone, you're oved bishvilam, you work for them. So what degree of subjugation are we talking about? The Rambam says it doesn't mean servitude. We're not expecting them to sign on to eternal servitude in order to make peace to us. It means that they will accept our authority. They're not going to try and take over the country through political means and attempt to become political leaders or cultural leaders. They'll accept that their role in the nation is subservient, and after having proven to be an enemy, there's an understanding that part of the treaty is they have to lie low. Thus says the Rambam. Yeah. Yes.
Where you get a peace offering alongside the fact that the aggressors will then adopt some of the Sheva Mitzvah.
What aspect of this is bothering you?
Any of them, not kill.
How can they not accept the Sheva Mitzvahs, or how can they?
I'm speaking of, I understood it tonight.
Yes.
You should always offer peace, but
yes.
the condition
Condition is peace, plus, yes.
Is that they would keep the Shevet
Yes.
And I don't understand how that's so idealistic. It's impossible. It would never be fulfilled.
It doesn't mean that, look, there's individuals and there's nations. Sometimes peace can be achieved with nations, and the nation says we're going to institute this as our rules, like modern day UK, and we expect that in any Western nation. They're not going to kill, there's going to be not going to steal. There'll be systems of justice rather than allowing anarchy. And there's also peace with individuals. Little known is, for example, the Rambam. This is quite important, by the way. It's beyond the scope of this year. I addressed it a while back, I think, on Sunday morning in philosophy. We have a mitzvah Tzimcha Zeich Amalek. The Rambam says that an Amaleki who says, I'm willing to accept Sheva mitzvahs b'neinach, is not included in Tzimcha Zeich Amalek, in the mitzvah of obliterating Amalek. It completely changes how we view the halacha. Amalek is a death cult. It's a dangerous people that have proven a culture of such deep enmity that we have an obligation to attack them. However, if an Amaleki says, I'm willing to sign on to Sheva mitzvahs b'neinach and become a ger toshav, then again, we're not, the Rambam's view is that we're not mechuyev to destroy them. They've accepted upon themselves values. So again, the same mashal as we had before. New Zealand and Japan are not a threat to us with their non-acceptance of Sheva mitzvahs b'neinach. We would like it if every ben Noach accepted the 7 Noachide commandments, but they're not a threat in not so doing. There's several nations who are our near neighbors with a deep sense of enmity, where we have to require them to accept the Noachide laws, otherwise they're a threat and a danger to us. So this calling out in peace is it doesn't mean that every single individual, there'll never be a murderer in any people. It means it'll be accepted as a sort of constitution of this folk, of this people, or as a collective. Again, this could be a battle against a village or a small tribe or a town, and there's that expectation of acceptance. They're not particularly tough, the Sheva mitzvahs enough. I mean, they're quite basic.
I'm not talking about against Israel or Jewish people.
So if we're talking about
battles,
yes,
as far as I'm aware, all the battles Jewish people have is clearly the other side is setting out to destroy every single person.
Not necessarily, not quite, and we'll get to this later. The most extreme example of Milchemes Mitzvah is a one that's easy to understand in a sense. A defensive war where we're being attacked. Right, we get that. And there maybe you don't have to call out in peace, by the way, because they've attacked. So there's no reality to calling out in peace. Again, we'll see the modern day poskim. Hopefully we'll get time. We'll see Rabbi Yisraeli's Teshuvah, which says this doesn't apply once they've attacked. But there are Milchemes Mitzvahs where there isn't an overt attack. So, for example, we're required to wage war against Amalek. We're required to wage war against Canaan. Now, how do we live with it morally? We're just aggressively attacking Canaan and Amalek. We live with it morally because we see it as a longer term danger. Were we not to do so, eventually at some point they would attack us. But they're not immediately attacking us. It wasn't as if Amalek was in a perpetual state of warfare with the Jews. So in that case, calling out in peace makes sense, as long as they accept Sheva mitzvahs b'neinach and are willing to accept a degree of subjugation in order to relinquish the threat. Again, we'll see how this plays out in modern HALACHAH, but this was discussed quite significantly in Israel in the only war really where Israel proactively attacked as a longer-term defensive measure, which was called the Suez operation. So the posting there discussed, is a Milchemes Mitzvah a defensive war? It's the clearest category of Milchemes Mitzvah is a defensive war. But does that mean literally where you're being attacked? Or does it mean where you have intelligence reasons to think that you need to engage in advance of the enemy attack and the like? And again, that was discussed. I again want to reiterate that it's very, very difficult extrapolating from classic sources to the modern day warfare in Israel, and I'm very conscious that Israel is currently fighting, and I'm not saying anything trite, but there are at least three types of Milchemes Mitzvah. There's the clear case where we're literally being attacked and we're defending ourselves, where maybe calling out for peace doesn't make sense, but then there could be a preemptive strike, in which case it might make sense. And there could be a strike against Canaan or Amalekim, which in a sense we're the aggressors and is therefore poses a moral problem. How can we do that? And the answer is we have trust in Hashem that this is necessary because there's some inbuilt pathological hatred there that makes this necessary. Sorry, John. Sorry, come to that.
Yeah, just briefly from a strategic point of view, becomes even more complicated because strategic defense can involve having to go on the offense, and actually that's the position that Israel is in because it doesn't have any land to give away or retreat.
Yeah.
Any loss of land is tantamount to defeat.
So Israel always, the doctrine of IDF is always to move the battle as quickly as possible onto enemy land 100. It doesn't have the luxury of, let's say, Russia is an extreme example the other way around. Yeah.
But does it have, I think I might say there are three periods historically when other nations, maybe out of fear, did agree to be subdued to Israel in Yehoshua,
Yeah.
Zobin and Shlom HaMelech, and the Hashmonaim, they conquered and they actually converted
Yes.
the Idumeans from whom Herod came about.
Yes.
And in the Galil, they actually made these people Jewish.
Yes. The interesting thing, so those online, David is showing that there are historical examples where we find subjugation taking place. The interesting thing is all three examples turned out quite badly for Klal Yisrael, and Chazal were quite critical of Klal Yisrael for behaving this way. So there's certainly no great value and ideal in subjugating. Even if there's a halachic mechanism to on occasion allow it, Chazal didn't have a great view of it, and it didn't turn out historically very well in any of the three examples. So it's very, very interesting. Again, I was saying to you before you came that the share is so big. I was thinking of looking at those parshas, and I'm going to hopefully in course of the share give one example from Nach, but not more than that about how some of these things played out, because again, otherwise it becomes overwhelming. Okay, so that's for those online. Are you still? I'm always because we've got internet problems here. I'm always a little bit worried that if anyone's able to just show me their screen, I'd be very grateful. So, oh, wonderful. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so that's calling out for peace. Then there is the famous halacha of not destroying trees in siege. This is printed on the top of page in the handouts. Apologies. This is printed on. At the top of page 2, about a quarter of the way down. This is still Dvarim Kaf. That's why I gave it a separate box. And the pasuk says, Ki totsur al ir yomim rabim, when you besiege a city for many days, to war against it, make war against it, and seize it. Lo sashchis es eitzah, don't destroy the trees. And again, I'm not going to go into, in the context of this share, the parameters of this halacha, other than one cut and paste from the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs, in which the Rambam says, I printed this below this, Rambam in his Book of Commandments, mitzvah, the negative mitzvahs 57, Nun Zayin, that this is about halfway down page 2. Mitzvah Nun Zayin, the 57th commandment in the Torah, is a prescription against destroying trees, when we besiege a city, crucial words in bold, in order to oppress its people and cause them pain. So we're not allowed to use wanton destruction as an act of psychological warfare or punishment or pain against our oppressors. The diuk in the Rambam, the implication in the Rambam is, of course you can cut down trees if that's necessary for the military action. So sometimes when you lay siege, for example, you need to clear grounds around the city or something like that. So of course, then you can do so if the trees are needed for firewood or for building siege engines. Then of course you can do so. The Rambam is saying, don't do so as an act of destruction. Don't use destruction as part of your military campaign. And the Rambam extrapolates it. I didn't print this. He extrapolates it for other ones in destruction also, and others understands that the trees are just an example. And again, I'm trying to sort of summarize in one view what's more of a halachic discussion, but I'm just trying to give a flavor of these halachas. The final halacha, maybe I'll mention I'll do two more. One additional parsha is the parsha in Devarim 21, which is the story of the Yafas Toa, the captive woman. Now, again, this story needs a lot of analysis, and this halacha rather needs a lot of analysis, and it's potentially a morally problematic one. It's one that raises questions. I spoke about it in my philosophy series when I looked at moral problems in the Torah. All I will say though is that at least when one reads Pshutoi Shel Mikra, this is a story of exceptional protection for civilians, because the pasuk says. It acknowledges captivity that occurs in warfare, and captivity of women in warfare was part of the norm, certainly at the day. And the pasuk says, don't just abuse and use her, but take her home, she should be given the chance to mourn her family, which is incredible sensitivity, right? She's not just this object to use, but she's been given a chance to mourn her family. And if you do choose to enter a relationship with her, she has to become a full wife. She does not become a concubine or a lesser wife. She has to have the full status of a wife with all the halachas in place in halacha of ksuva and all the protection that is put in place. And if one doesn't want her, then she gets set free. She can't be sold as a slave. So this is even though there's much else to question about this halacha, it's a very clear example of protection for captives. And here I'll share the one example I said that I would give from Tanakh, which is in Melachim Beis, Perek Vav, in which the king of Aram wages warfare against Melech Yisrael. So already, just to remind ourselves, the Jewish people are split sadly into two nations. Yehuda on the one side and what we call Yisrael on the other side. And Yehuda, by and large, is more or less keeps a halachic life. Yisrael, the breakaway kingdom of the 10 tribes, to a large degree drifts away, and there's constant tensions between their kings and the message of the Nevi'im, the prophets who are giving rebuke and so on. At this particular juncture, Elisha comes to the rescue of the Jewish king in Yisrael, and there's a whole story there of spying and strategy and Elisha davening for them to be rescued. To cut a long story short, though, Yisrael, the kingdom of Israel, wins against Aram, and they capture captives. And the Melech Yisrael turns to Elisha and says, "What should I do? Ha'akeh, should I smite them? Should I kill the captives?" And amazingly, Elisha answers, "Lo sakeh, don't smite them. Ha'asher shavisa b'chabercha, those that you have captive, sim lechem u'mayim lefneim, v'yochlu v'yishtu, put bread and water in front of them so that they can eat and drink." And in this context, where they no longer pose a threat, the Pasukim carry on, send them home. As long as you know they're not going to be a threat anymore, even send them home. So long before the Geneva Convention, Elisha is saying to the Melech Yisrael that it's obvious that that captives shouldn't just be mistreated needlessly. Feed them, water them, and if appropriate, send them home. That's what comes out from Melachim. Now again, how the role of Nach in halacha, and to what degree anything in Nach can be extrapolated to an absolute halacha, isn't clear cut at all. But certainly this parsha in Melachim gives us a sense of how halacha views these things. The final sort of set of things I wanted to look at in terms of just general chazorah on halachas, again, it's a very famous set of psukim in Zvarim Kaf Gimel, which I printed on at the bottom of page 2, which is a moral standard in the camps. I didn't think all the psukim, but there's halachas about tum and tara, there's halachas about physical hygiene and the toilet arrangements in the camps, the bathroom arrangements in the camps. There's a halacha about mikre laila, a man who has a seminal emission, and so on. In other words, we're demanding of soldiers in Tanakh a very high level of kedusha when they're engaged in camp warfare. And on my source sheet, that was the final bullet point I put at the top of page 1. So the top of page 1 is the summary, basically, and then following that, I printed the psukim of samples of sorts of the halachas of warfare in the Torah. Now, what I want to do is move swiftly on and simply look at milchemes mitzvah and milchemes reshus, the two categories of war that halacha knows, which are compulsory warfare and voluntary warfare. And basically speaking, all these 6 halachas that we printed, and a 7th halacha, which I don't think I printed here, which is to not lay siege all the way around an enemy. Which categories of war do they apply to? And the bottom line is going to be, it's complicated, it's not clear cut. There's debate amongst the Rishonim. There may be some halachas apply to all warfare and other halachas only apply to voluntary war but not compulsory warfare. There may even be distinctions within the categories, so there may be two classes of compulsory warfare. And basically, beyond saying that, I'm not going to go into it, it's way beyond the scope of it. It gets very, very technical. All I'm going to say for now is there are two categories of war, milchemes mitzvah and milchemes reshus. And whenever we meet a halacha of warfare, we have to ask ourselves which category it applies to. Next week, we will look at this, please God, in more detail, because I will look at the siege we'll look at the concept of siege. Obviously, there's again been a lot of discussion around the siege or so-called siege of Gaza. And again, I'm not directly extrapolating to anything going on at the moment, but it's definitely something in our minds. And there's very, very important shuvas of the poskim around the siege of Beirut, which was a much more complicated operation in the sense. And there's considerable debate there amongst leading poskim, Reb Shlomo Goren and Reb Shaul Yisraeli and others, who, and we'll look at next week that halacha, which is why I didn't print it here, of siege warfare. But for now, we've looked at 6 other halachas, and there's debate about how they play out with milchemes mitzvah and milchemes reshus. So I want to spend the next few minutes doing is just looking at milchemes reshus and milchemes mitzvah and trying to define these terms, and then hopefully we'll then be able to get on to proportionality and civilian casualties after that. So let's turn to the Rambam at the top of page 3, top of page 3 in the source sheet, which is from the Rambam in Hilchos Melachim. And let's even just briefly glance at the English, and let's not even read the Hebrew. A king should not wage other wars before milchemes mitzvah. Okay, so the first priority of a king is before you go on expansionist wars or voluntary wars, engage in milchemes mitzvah. What is considered a milchemes mitzvah? The war against the 7 nations occupied Eretz Yisrael, the war against Amalek, and a war fought to assist Yisrael from an enemy which attacks them. After that, the king can engage in milchemes reshus, i.e. a war fought with other nations to expand the borders of Israel or magnify its greatness and reputation. Okay, so that is Halacha Aleph in chapter 5 of the Rambam. So let's just try and analyze this halacha. The first thing the halacha tells us is there is a category of war called milchemes mitzvah. It's an obligation to engage in such war. And this is a war of destruction against Amalek, a war of destruction against the 7 nations, and a war fought to assist Israel from enemy which attacks them. So I already mentioned these 3 categories in answer to Malcolm's question. I'm not going to go into Amalek and the 7 nations. It's beyond the scope of our share. But clearly, milchemes mitzvah is a defensive war where we're attacked. Does this only apply to direct attack or even a strategic war in anticipation of attack? Good question. But certainly when there's an attack, that's called a milchemes mitzvah. Milchemes reshus is one that we probably need to chew over a little bit morally in a sense, because the Torah seems to give justification for a war of expanding the borders of Israel or to magnify its greatness and reputation. It's beyond the scope of the shir, but just very briefly touching that. What would be a moral justification for that? Why is there a concept on milchemes reshus? Why should one be allowed to just engage in warfare to expand borders or to expand the greatness? That seems morally difficult. Why would that be milchemes reshus? So it could be for long-term safety. In other words, beyond milchemes mitzvah, even if defensive war, proactive war is necessary, sometimes for strategic aims, you need to keep the economy going, you need long-term safety. That's number one. Or because Israel then, as now, inhabited an exceptionally unpleasant neighborhood, and it was surrounded by pagan nations who were doing terrible things. They were engaged in child sacrifices and in pagan worship and in abusive and awful slavery and in torture and so on. And therefore, maybe there's a moral component that when Eretz Yisrael is secure and strong, it can expand its borders and try and magnify its reputation for positive purposes. As I said, whenever this was engaged in, it didn't end that well. But halacha does give an allowance for that. Now, this category of milchemes reshus has to have agreement from more than one authority to engage in, meaning to say that basically, like many modern constitutions, there's a division of powers in the Torah system, and you have the Nevi'im, you have the Kahuna, you have the Sanhedrin, and you have the Melech. The Melech most closely approximates executive power. He's the one that makes decisions about taxes and building bridges and maintaining roads and going to war. King has the sole executive ability to engage in milchemes mitzvah. Why milchemes mitzvah? Because the king has to act. If the nation's being attacked, you need someone to step forward. That's the prerogative of a king. However, if it's milchemes reshus, a voluntary war, you need the Sanhedrin on side, and other Rishonim say you also need Nevi'im on side. So you also need the Urim and Tumim on side. So let's have a quick look in Halacha base in the Rambam, Halacha 2 in the Rambam, a quarter of the way down, page 3. There's no need to seek the permission of the court to wage a milchemes mitzvah. Rather, he may go out of his own volition and force out the nations to go out with him. In contrast, he may not lead the nation out to wage a milchemes reshus unless the court of 71 judges approves. Okay, so that's the Rambam about milchemes mitzvah and milchemes reshus. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through chapter 6 in the Rambam, which I printed, which is basically the rest of page 3. But basically, there the Rambam brings the halacha of calling out in peace. And he says the exception to this is, he speaks about subjugation, which I mentioned already, that we can subjugate, calling out in peace involves subjugation. And then he speaks about milchama against, if they don't agree to subjugation. In fact, let's just look at halacha 4 near the bottom of page 3. If they don't agree to a peaceful settlement, or they agree but refuse to accept the 7 mitzvahs, that was the point again that Malcolm we were discussing, then war should be waged against them. And then he says, all males past majority should be killed, their money and their children should be taken as spoil, but neither their women nor their children should be killed, etc., etc. So this is the conclusion of the Rambam. Now, here again, we face a seemingly moral dilemma or problem, because it seems to say you can kill all males and just keep the women and children alive. We'll see later Rabbi Yisraeli addresses this a little bit, and he's open to 2 possibilities. Either that in halacha, warfare can include a revenge element to it. Vengeance is justified. Or this is an example of threat. In other words, any adult males are potential military operatives, and therefore this is part of a defensive act. And as opposed to the youngsters who and the women who don't pose a threat. So again, this is a little bit beyond the scope of the shir, but we will touch back on this source. Okay, so just to summarize what we've said so far, we've seen an array of halachas that apply to warfare, including protection of civilian with the Afas Torah story and the captive story in Melachim, including high moral standards in the camps, in the war camps, and prohibition against needless wanton destruction of the enemy, and a variety of other halachas. Then we've seen there's 2 categories of milchama, milchemes mitzvah, and milchemes reshus. Milchemes mitzvah includes defensive warfare. Milchemes reshus is more expansionist and needs the agreement of the Sanhedrin, and according to other Rishonim, also the Nevi'im or Mitzvim. And we've seen, and then we saw the idea of calling out in peace and voluntary submission. What, if anything, can be taken out of this when thinking about modern warfare? And how does this extrapolate to the thorny question of civilian casualties in warfare? So I want to make really 3 points of introduction before we look at this. The first is that everyone agrees that harming innocent civilians needlessly is wrong. We saw the Rambam in Malachim that we just saw saying that anyone who isn't a potential combatant shouldn't be harmed, and we saw the sources in Malachim in which the captives weren't killed because they no longer posed a threat. At least that was what Elisha said to the Melech Yisrael. Whether that's a rule always or just a sensitivity, that's clear. But that I think is not a controversial statement. Then we saw, as we discussed, the debate around milchemes mitzvah and milchemes reshus, and I want to touch upon whether, in the modern day context, these halachic categories apply. But then add that I don't think either way, and however we understand it, I don't think it makes a difference to the questions of treatment of civilians. And the third point of introduction I want to make is really just using this forum to speak about the messy thinking that lies behind the concept of proportionality as it's being thrown around at the moment. And I appreciate this is a share, but nonetheless, since I'm talking about halachas of civilian casualties, I want to just mention that I hope nothing I say is as I said last week, I have zero insight into Israel's strategic decisions and its military decisions, and it's very easy to sit in the comfort of Hendon and pontificate about things. That's certainly not my intention in the least. And I know that Israel and its army behave exceptionally morally. But I do want to mention that this word proportionality is a word that's thrown around in a completely ridiculous context. Sometimes it's taken to mean that somehow it's only moral if the armed forces, an enemy, you have to somehow not use forces above and beyond that which the enemy possesses, and somehow there's like chivalry in warfare, and that it's somehow unethical to if one protagonist has a military superiority, for it to use that military superiority, and that's clearly nonsense. On the contrary, it's immoral. If you have a job to defend people and you don't use the resources you have available, that's clearly immoral. Sometimes proportionality is taken to mean that somehow the casualties on the other side have to be proportional to the casualties. So Israel can engage in defensive warfare as long as it doesn't kill more than 1,000, several hundred, whatever the exact number of casualties caused. Again, I mean that's just philosophically nonsense and not what the doctrine of proportionality really means. It doesn't even mean that somehow the death of civilians on the other side should even closely approximate the death of civilians on Israel's side. All it means is that every armed conflict has to have an aim. The aim has to be a justified one in the rules of law, and the civilians killed as a tragic and painful, deeply painful result of that action have to be proportionate to the goals of the action. So you have to understand the goals of the action. In Israel's case, it said very clearly its goal is to eliminate Hamas. It can no longer believe it can contain Hamas and ring-fence it. And the death of civilians, tragically, through that process, have to be proportionate to the aim. And anyone therefore talks about proportionality has to be able to suggest what do they think is a proportionate response? I mean, how would they set about ridding Hamas of Gaza of Hamas in a better and more efficient way with less tragic deaths of civilians? And that's that's what the law means. That's what this rule means. Now, you can question Israel's aim to rid itself of Hamas. That's one debate. But if you accept the aim, which I think any honest person would, then we have to accept that the rules of law, as currently understood in internationally, allow the tragic and painful death of civilians. And again, I want to emphasize saying that does not mean any lack of care and heartbreak over the death of civilians in Gaza, innocent civilians in Gaza. And this is not about Chas v'shalom saying that weighing up the value of an Arab life or a Jewish life. It's simply the tragic reality of Israel as a country is entitled to defend itself, and proportionality does not remove its entitlement to defend itself. It simply says it has to take due care to minimize civilian casualties on the side. And the painful reality is that Israel, in so doing, is risking to some proportionate way the life of its own soldiers in order to ensure an action which will minimize casualties of innocents on the other side. So I just say this because there's so much confusion around terms that I felt it's appropriate to sort of say this. What is the status of Israel's wars currently? So can Israel engage in milchemes reshus from a halachic point of view, or as the Rambam says, does it need the Sanhedrin? And we no longer possess the Sanhedrin, and therefore the concept of milchemes reshus is not a voluntary war is not relevant. The poskim don't arrive at a clear conclusion on the subject. The only rishon that addresses this almost specifically is the Meiri. And the Meiri, maybe let me just speak a little bit about the role of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is a court, it's the high court of the Jewish people. It has two functions. It is a legal court, and it is also a representative body of the will of the Jewish people. And in some ways acts as a sense of collective national sentiment, or the expression of the views of Am Yisrael. And this is found in a piece by Ramosha Soloveitchik, the oldest son of Chaim Brisker and the father of the more famous Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, in which he speaks about in Kiddush HaChodesh, that even with the annulling of the Sanhedrin, there was still a Sanhedrin function. This is found in the Rambam's concept that if the whole of the Jewish people agree to a return of the traditional smicha, the classic rabbinic ordination, they can act and role in place of the Sanhedrin and restore it. There is a concept of the will of the nation replacing a Sanhedrin when there is no Sanhedrin active and available, at least with respect to some halachas. And the Meiri explicitly says that in the absence of a Sanhedrin, the will of the nation can allow a milchemes reshus. So just to summarize what we're saying, a voluntary war, a war which is longer term defensive or maybe expansionist in nature, needs the decision of the king and the Sanhedrin. We don't have a king and we don't have a Sanhedrin. Can a Sanhedrin be replaced nowadays? The Meiri, at least, is of the view that yes, if there's a clear national consensus about something. Can a king be replaced nowadays? We'll get to that in a moment. Let's leave Milchemes Reshus, the voluntary war, and now talk about Milchemes Mitzvah. Who has the right to lead a Milchemes Mitzvah? The king. Well, what do we do in a time in which there is no king? Again, the Meiri addresses this point, and the Meiri says explicitly that it's the king or an equivalent Jewish leadership. And let's just have a quick look at that. This is source at the bottom of page 3, source 1, the Meiri and Sota. Kol milchama shemalchi Yisrael, any war which the Malchi Yisrael, the kings of Israel, Oyman higayem, all their leaders, put in bold, nilchomim imoveim, fight with enemies, hein milchemes mitzvah, is a milchemes mitzvah. So we have a clear source again in a Meiri in which he says, don't assume that this is only only with a king. Any leader of Klal Yisrael can step in. Any leadership body that has authority to run the nation, the executive of the nation, can step in and engage in warfare. And therefore, the presumption is that a defensive war taking place in Israel is a milchemes mitzvah. So, just to summarize, for a milchemes reshus, you need a king, an executive authority, and a national consensus, or Sanhedrin rather. Sorry, classic halacha says, for a voluntary war, you need a melech and a Sanhedrin, a king and Sanhedrin. The Meiri says the Sanhedrin can be replaced by national consensus, and a king can be replaced by national leadership. And a milchemes mitzvah, a defensive war, is triggered by the melech, and the Meiri again says that can be replaced by the manhigut, the leadership of the Jewish people. So I believe that the current wars, according to the Meiri at least, is a milchemes mitzvah. Now, is there a massive nafkamina? Not really, because either way, Israel has to defend itself. But it would mean that, at least in principle, the halachas of milchemes mitzvah would click in. And again, there's an array of practical halachic differences, including various leniencies beyond the strict ones in terms of Chilul Shabbos and various others. And I want to tell you that an array of poskim have paskins at this halacha l'maisa. You have Rav Herzog, of course the first chief rabbi of Israel. You have the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, who dealt extensively with the halachas of milchama, of war, who came to that conclusion. And then you have the late Rabbi Vadia Yosef, who has several teshuvas on this matter, and they all believe that the halachic category of milchemes mitzvah is applicable. Someone posted here, are the Sanhedrin supposed to use non-halachic considerations to decide on milchemes reshus? It depends on what the justification for milchemes reshus is. Is milchemes reshus just economic or the like, or is it something about bringing the Jewish people's message to the world? In which case, that would be part of the sort of meta-halachic consideration that the Sanhedrin would bring. Yes, David.
The thing is, the king had to rule in accordance with halacha. He had to keep the state of terrorism.
Yes. Yes.
And modern governments don't do that. So can we really say they're in the same position as the king?
Okay, a very, very good question. I was thinking about this. What defines the manhigut of the Jewish people now? Is it the Knesset? And does the Knesset really reflect Torah values and so on? The point here, though, is I think there's uniform agreement about from anyone who does follow Torah values to this war. So even if we just take a selection of the Knesset, or we would take the Gedolei HaPoskim, it is obvious to the full, however you define the manhigut of the Jewish people, it is obvious that this is a defensive war which needs to be undertaken. And therefore, I didn't feel one had to go into that distinction. The Poskim, the Tzitz Eliezer, the Rabbi Vadia, do speak about this question. What do we do with a money good that includes people that don't take into account Torah values, and it does. Thankfully, ever decreasing, meaning Baruch Hashem, not just now, but in general over the last decades, the resurgence of Torah values in Israel is completely unprecedented and unexpected. But nonetheless, in this war, in a sense, we conduct that, and it seems to me clear that this is in that sense a milchemes mitzvah. But yes,
is there any limit to, again, proportionality? Say you would have to use an atom bomb to get one terrorist living amongst 10 million people.
Yeah. So this is a very good question. In secular law, that's exactly what proportionality means. That's the point that the law is trying to bring out, which is in conducting a war. I want to make this point clear. You need to ask two questions: is the war aim legitimate? Is the goal the country has set itself legitimate? Number one. And number two, in trying to achieve that legitimate outcome, is it doing so in a proportionate way? Proportionality doesn't need unique equality between the attacker and the defender. It doesn't mean that Israel can't cause significantly more deaths, tragically, to civilians than it suffered. None of that is what proportionality means. It means in terms of its goal, is it assuming the goal is legitimate, which we think it is, but once you justify a goal, then you have to ask yourself something else, which is embarking on the achievement of that goal. Is it proportionate? And therefore, an atom bomb causing to take out one person would be an example, a clear-cut example where maybe it wouldn't be proportionate. However, in secular law, case studies and examples and so on are all enter into how we define these terms. And for the USA or the UK to determine proportionality, one would have to look at what was considered justified by their lawyers when they went into Iraq and caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, or in Afghanistan, tens of thousands of deaths, or going back further, the bombing of German cities near the end of the Second World War, and of course the use of nuclear weapons in Japan. So proportionality, even once we subscribe to this idea of proportionality, that it needs to be proportionate to its goals, how proportionate is very, very unclear. The question we need to ask ourselves is there an equivalent in halacha of this? And that's really what we're asking when we're asking about civilian casualties. So I want to, in the quarter now remaining to me, just try and share to the degree possible what I can in answer to this question. And the first thing I want to say, and this is sometimes missed, is that you can't extrapolate from individual interactions to national war. In other words, it's in philosophy. This is often discussed. Objects have qualities different to their constituent parts. A wall does something different to a brick. So you can't look at the qualities of a brick and say a wall just does what lots of bricks do. An animal, a tiger, is different to a cell. You can't just look at what cells do and say, well, a tiger will do what lots and lots of cells do. It begins behaving in a different way. And it's the same in halacha. A nation and its encounters start behaving differently to the way individuals do. And I just want to give a series of examples of this. And the first source I printed with respect to this idea is the Minchas Chinuch at the top of page 4 in source 2. And I'm not going to go fully into the literature around this, other than to say that we are aware that there are 3 cardinal mitzvahs that we are mechuyev, obligated to give our lives up for. Don't sacrifice your life to avoid avodah zarah, murder, and adulterous liaisons. The Minchas Chinuch simply points out that when you get to the national level, this seems to fall apart, because otherwise the whole concept of milchama doesn't make sense. In other words, there's a mitzvah to go to war. You have to go to war to conquer Israel. You have to go to war against the Amalekim. You have to go to war against the 7 nations, and you have to go to war for a defensive war. Well, what justifies any of that? Why should I, as a soldier, have to put myself in a position of risk and in order to engage in the mitzvah of war? So this is a very painful question, and as I said, I'm conscious that we're dealing with real life here, and but nonetheless, the concept is one that the poskim address, and it's as clear that inherent in the mitzvah of war is a different rubric to the normal one of Yehorig V'al Yaver, the normal principles of Yehorig V'al Yaver. So this is classic example number 1. And Minchas Chinuch speaks about this. The famous Briskerov discusses this. Rav Shechter in his Nefesh Harav, for those who are interested, for those who want to look up sources, page 97, 98, he speaks about what are the parameters of this. Is this only when the existence of the entire state is threatened, even when part of the country is threatened? Some of this debate came up in the halachic discourse around land for peace, because there were poskim who said, well, land for peace is a no-brainer. If we knew that we would get peace, big question. But if in theory you knew you would get peace by giving up lands, of course you have to give up lands because of Pikuach Nefesh. What's the question? Life comes first. Rav Soloveitchik concurred with that view. And he said, as long as this doesn't threaten the national existence of Israel, and as long as you're convinced the peace will work, two big questions, in principle, the Torah answer to this question is clear. Give up life for Pikuach Nefesh, trumps land. But when it comes to national existence, certainly Pikuach Nefesh wouldn't trump it. That's the essence of the allowance to go for war. So Rav Soloveitchik is, if you like, a halachic minimalist in how far he thinks this suspension of the regular law of risking life applies, and he thinks it's suspended only in a case of survival of the state. On the opposite ends of the spectrum, you have poskim who argue that even milchemes reshus must involve some risk of life, and nonetheless a king is allowed to make a decision about milchemes reshus. Nations go to war. It's built into the fabric of in a sense, mitzvahs b'nei noach, that a melech can take someone to war, and therefore evident even a milchemes reshus justifies the suspension of the normal rubric of life-taking precedence. So, okay, you have a halachic debate around how far you can go in this. But the core principle that on a national level you can't cut and paste from private individual halacha is a very clear one. Okay, now the response to the Minchas Chinuch's question of how can a soldier be called to give up, risk his life in order to engage in war, and his answer, therefore, it must be that war is different. You could challenge that. And you can say, well, maybe this is working with the normal principles of personal interaction in which I'm saving lives. If we don't go to war, other citizens' lives will be affected. But that's also not halachically correct. Because in halacha, someone is entitled to say, who says my blood is less rare than your blood? Why should I risk my life to save your life? Normally, we use it the other way around. The Gemara says, I can't kill someone to save my life, because who says that my blood is redder than their blood? But the argument also goes the other way around. I don't have to risk my life to save someone else's life, because who says my blood is redder than your blood? So again, if we look at this on a personal and individual scale, we're using the wrong equations. We're using the wrong tools to determine this. We have to understand that the essence of the concept of milchama, the idea that war is allowed sometimes in halacha, teaches us that the normal equations are incorrect. Then we have a third attempt at understanding war, which is the concept of roideif. The halacha of roideif is, if I'm being pursued by someone, or indeed I see A pursuing B, I'm allowed to kill A, the pursuer, to save B. We define the act as an act of rescue rather than an act of killing. It's an act of, this is the halacha of roideif, the pursuer halacha. Now the halacha is that in roideif, if you're yochel lahatzilo be'echad me'evorov, if you can save the potential victim by taking out one of the limbs of the roideif, you have to do so. You have to minimize damage. So if A is pursuing B, and I can defend myself by shooting them in the legs rather than in the chest, I'm obligated to do so. That's a law in private halacha of roideif. And indeed, by the way, Israel has this in its policies when it's defending its borders. The instruction of the soldiers is fire warning shots, try and aim for the legs, and the like. In milchama, many poskim disagree, and they say no. Milchama has a different equation to private warfare, and in war you can't do that. That's not applicable in war. In war you have to fight. Fighting means that you're risking, you're attacking the aggressor and defending yourself without having to go through that cheshbon of could I minimize the damage done to the soldier on the other side by wounding or injuring rather than killing. Now, I've done a lot of talking, so I want to just use the last minutes to have a look at a couple of sources inside. And a very interesting source in this is the Gur Aryeh, the Maharal. And the context of the Maharal is the famous story of Shimon and Levi waging war against Shechem and killing the civilians of Shechem. They massacre the whole population. Now, the Ramban and the Rambam and others ask, why should innocent civilians have been killed? What possible justification is there for that? And by the way, Yaakov wasn't super happy with them either. So we're not saying that they made necessarily the right decision, but certainly we would expect them to behave in line with some value in so doing. They must have been thinking of something. And again, this gets us, I don't mean to get into halachic discourse as to whether Kodem Matan Torah, before Matan Torah, the Shvatim kept halacha or not, and to what degree you can learn halacha from events before Matan Torah or not. But certainly we would expect their action to be in line with Torah values in a sense. So the Ramban and Rambam and others give various answers that somehow all the civilians were culpable. They should have set up systems of justice and didn't do that, in allowing their prince to behave in this atrocious manner and effectively having a rape culture. They are themselves chayiv, because one of the Sheva mitzvahs in Noach is to set up systems of justice and law, and there's various answers given. The Maharal gives a completely different answer, and he says this is milchama, this is war, and in war we have a different equation. When you're in warfare, you're waging against the whole enemy. The state is the enemy. The enemy's state is the enemy, even at the price of civilians, innocent civilians, getting caught up in this. So let's have a brief look at the Maharal. This is source 3 on the top of page 4. Ach kosher. He says this is difficult. Im Shechem chota, if Shechem sinned, what did the whole city sin how did the whole city sin? Let's miss out the next paragraph where he brings the Rambam and other answers to this question. Vinira. This is the second paragraph in source 3 at the top of page 4. It would appear, he says, this is not a question at all. You can't compare two nations who are fighting, like the Bnei Yisrael and the Canaanim, because they are two peoples, and he brings various pesukim to that. In such a case, he says, second line of the second paragraph, they're allowed to fight like a nation. It's coming to fight another nation. And the Torah allows that to take place. And then he says, even though that the Omra Torah, that the Torah says, you're meant to call out in peace. That's where they haven't yet attacked Israel. Where they've already attacked the Jewish people, where they disgrace and discuss the behavior with Dina. Since this is one of them, but it's the leader and it represents the nation, they attack them first. They're allowed to take their vengeance against the whole people. War is engaged between nations, and tragically that means that sometimes innocent people will suffer. So this is the Maharal on this matter. Now, there's much to question about how far we can extrapolate this Maharal. First of all, is the Maharal alone a senior enough halachic source to justify broader behavior? And can we extrapolate from, at the end of the day, a piece in the behavior of Bnei Yaakov to a modern day warfare? That remains a little more complicated, but the Maharal is an important source. And in a moment, I just want to conclude by seeing a modern day, relatively modern day posek who uses this in practical halacha. Sorry. Yes, he sees it as war. I skimmed through it, but he argues a little bit more around this. There's also Chiddush that he's already seeing the Shvatim as a nation, as a small nation. He says that they've made the transition from being a family to being a nation, which is interesting in terms of the narrative of Bereshis. For now, in a sense, I'm just trying to draw out the principle that the Maharal teaches us, which is what war is differently. I'll tell you one other nafkamina, one other distinction between private and public again, which is the concept of kivush milchama. Wars have spoils. Land that's captured now belongs to the victorious nation. In private affairs, that's theft. So even if I'm acting defensively, it's still theft. So if I attack A and take over their home, I don't suddenly become the owner of the home. That's called being a ganav. If A attacks me and I defend myself, and in so doing I take over their home, I still have to give the home back to their yarshim. It doesn't involve a transfer of property. But again, in national war, that's the concept of kivush milchama, spoils of war. So all I'm trying to bring out from the Minchas Chinuch in one example, and the Maharal in another example, is that wars behave differently to to personal interactions, and therefore should have their own halachas. We've run out of time, so I'm going to stop here because I don't want to go too far over the time. In Mirz Hashem, next week we will look at how Reb Shaul Yisraeli and Reb Shlomo Goren engaged in a halacha l'maisa debate around the applicability of this Minchas Chinuch and this Maharal and other sources to civilian casualties, and we'll see a range of approaches. But I think hopefully out of that discussion will emerge some form of consensus around this. That please God will be next week's share. In the meantime, I wish everyone a good evening and wish everyone well.
Thank you, Dayan Zobin.
Thank you very much for joining. Always honoured. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.